Hi there. It's wonderful to be here today to talk to you about boundary objects and coordination for creativity and innovation. I've devoted a great deal of my career to the study of boundary objects, so it's really a pleasure to be here on a symposium on the topic. So I was asked to say a few words about how I got started in studying boundary objects. And it really started when I was doing my dissertation work at University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where I was very inspired by the work of Susan Lee Starr here on the bottom right of the slide, and also the work of my advisor, Phil Agri, on the top. Both of them were very interested in this notion of how to support people coordinating to get work done in more open-ended situations. And these are situations where people are often collaborating or coordinating to try to innovate, to come up with new knowledge or to come up with new ways of doing things. Both Phil and Lee were interested very much in distributed artificial intelligence. Phil was a product of the MIT AI lab, and as he studied AI, he became rather disillusioned with some of the narrow approaches that focused just on cognition to studying artificial intelligence. In doing my work, I started to get interested in Lee's work on boundary objects. Lee's notions of boundary objects were different from a lot of the other concepts being used at the time and even now. Looking at coordination, a lot of the theories were very, very tied to specific tasks and to specific activities. And Lee's concept of boundary objects was a little broader. She defined them as informational objects that are used by different communities for different purposes and a means of coordination between actors. And this was like a general enough concept that it could be applied everywhere, which is why this concept has been used in many, many different disciplines and cited thousands of times. So the concept of boundary objects Lee put forth was written across a few different papers. The work has been taken up by many, expanded by a few, including myself. And this expansion from the idea of boundary objects tends to take a certain character and flavor, where boundary objects were objects that were to satisfy the informational requirements of each community of practice or group or department and maintained a common identity across sites. So a lot of work, not just my own, on boundary negotiating artifacts sort of said, well, there's other kinds of objects that sit in between communities of practice, groups, departments, that don't necessarily satisfy all the information requirements, that don't have this common identity. And we were expanding to say, like, let's look at other kinds of objects and artifacts, I use those interchangeably, that are used for collaborative sense-making, that are used to negotiate the boundary themselves. And so part of this was that we were looking at different kinds of objects that sit in between, but that we were also looking at different kinds of situations, ones that were a little more ambiguous, where maybe the outcome wasn't determined or the methods weren't really very set. So other ways to think about boundary objects and other ways that the notion of boundary objects have expanded is to think more about epistemic objects. They're technical objects that are ready to hand, that are complete and unproblematic. They tend to be fixed and stable. These are the ones that Lee wrote about the most in those early papers. The follow-on work, including this work by Ewenstein and White, talked a bit more about epistemic artifacts that are characterized by incompleteness, that they're partially expressed, they might have multiple instantiations, and they're continuously evolving. So you may think of like people collaborating around drawings, maybe they're sketching together, things that you would see in a brainstorming activity. And that these artifacts are often dynamic and able to enable knowledge. Now, it's really important to note that things aren't, just boundary, we don't have situations where it's just boundary objects and just boundary negotiating artifacts or just technical artifacts and just epistemic, but you should think of every collaboration having both of those kinds or multiple kinds. But as you go forth in a workflow, in a design project, you might go from having mostly epistemic objects to mostly technical artifacts. In a lot of the work that we've done thus far as technology developers, mostly we've been focused on technical artifacts because those are easier to instantiate, they're easier to see, they're a little more stable. But a lot of that work that we have to focus on going forward with boundary objects are ones where there are more epistemic objects and more epistemic work to be done. Complicated design projects, scientific research, things like that. So in thinking about these different types of design situations and these different types of artifacts, we also want to think about notions of power. And sometimes when I mention the notion of power to computational audience, people feel a little uncomfortable because people tend to think of one aspect of power, which is this one on the lower right, this notion of power as domination. But there are other ways to think of power, other definitions. There's power as a resource, meaning something that some have and some don't have, that we want to redistribute or perhaps not, depending on who you are. And power as empowerment. And it's hard to talk about empowerment without also talking about domination. But newer notions about power, like Amy Allen's work on the power of feminist theory, is talking about power as something that's relational. That's something that is being negotiated. And so anytime you think of a set of relationships between people and between artifacts, where things are getting done, decisions are being made, where relationships are being cultivated, you have a situation where we are making decisions about power. We're enacting power. So when we're thinking about relationships, it's useful to think about the things that we build as cultivating relationships. So going back to Phil's work on computation and human experience, which he published in '97, but the work dates back from the late '80s. He talks a lot about algorithms having a social context, about embodied agents having background understanding. Like, I know things about a cultural situation. I know things about the background of the people involved, the history and the values of an organization. And so these need to be taken account. And similarly, individuals are always creating themselves and their relationships, that these are things that shift and change over time. And so when he was talking about AI, and Lee was talking about AI in terms of distributed artificial intelligence, they are also saying, like, the intelligence exists in these communities of people, right? And how they interact and how they discover together and how they learn together. And so Phil talked about these ways forward for boundary objects and AI. And it's interesting because this work was laid out for us many years ago, but now many of us in CSCW and HCI and other fields are like coming back to this really important work and this really important thinking to look for ways forward. And Phil talked about embracing computation as being part of a history of ideas. If we think of every community as creating ideas and then being part of a history of ideas, to think about the things we create, boundary objects, a data repository, for example, could be a boundary object, or more specifically, a boundary negotiating artifact most of the time, if it's a living data repository. And we want to make transparent the underlying decisions and assumptions in the moment so that people understand the ramifications of their decisions and assumptions so they can see what happens when they present a new boundary negotiating artifact. In my original research, looking at a community of museum exhibition developers, there was an immediacy to creating a boundary negotiating artifact. Like, oh, here's a sketch for a new idea. Let's sit around, let's draw on it, let's discuss it, let's fight about it, let's celebrate it. There is this immediate feedback from the design group and then later from a larger community, where people could see how the decisions were being made, where people could question each other's assumptions. And that there's this ongoing inspection of premises and methods. It's not just, let's lock it down once and then keep it away from the community, that there's this commitment to this ongoing inspection, because there's an ongoing sense of sense-making, of creating new ways of doing things and new understandings. And again, we're looking at situations that are highly innovative, right? And so this is necessary for that process of innovation. So final thoughts about boundary objects. So objects that AI systems create can provoke and prevent different kinds of conversations. A lot of the ethnographic work that me and my colleagues have been doing are studying what kinds of conversations people have around which sets of boundary objects, which data repositories, which algorithms, which tools. And also this notion that different kinds of conversations implicate different kinds of boundary objects. A lot of the most interesting research we have to do has to do with these epistemic or boundary negotiating artifacts that are much harder to facilitate. How do you facilitate an opening of a design space? And that these different kinds of boundary objects facilitate different kinds of conversations. And part of our decision is to say, what kind of conversations do we want to encourage? And then thinking about how does it change the design space and our priorities when we think about the tools and systems we create as a communal project of sense-making. And not only a communal project of sense-making, but also precedent setting for who gets to have a say when about what and how. In creating tools and systems for coordination, we're already in the mix. We're having discussions about power. And so being mindful about the boundary objects that we're designing and using is really a very powerful way forward in terms of being thoughtful about the things that we produce and the effects that we have on the world. So I want to thank you for your attention today, and also thank my students who made all of this work and this presentation itself possible.